Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm taking a look at Captain Marvel. Since she has her movie out, she was obviously going to be the T4, and because the character has elements of PvP in her kit, I decided to T4 her just to see how she does there. Just as a heads up, if you wanted to see how the character does in PvE without a build, or at the highest level with something like a CTP of Rage, then this video might not give you that answer, since I decided to test her with a mighty CTP of Destruction to see how she would do as a hybrid character in PvE, and whether that would be the most ideal build for her in PvP. Regardless of the build though, you do get an idea of how much better she gets with this uniform compared to the previous one, as well as how much of an improvement the T4 provides her. So like I mentioned, I primarily tested the mighty CTP of Destruction on the character because I had that previously on her, and that is the one that I was most interested to see the performance in PvP. If you were curious to know how the character would have done with a base build and no damage proc at all, from the various testing that I've done with other characters, a mighty CTP of Destruction usually improves the clear time in World Lost Legend by about anywhere from 1 minute and 30 seconds to 2 minutes. So without the mighty Destruction, this character wouldn't have been able to clear the first phase of Null stage 59 within that 2-minute window, and wouldn't have been able to clear the fight entirely at the very end. Also, compared to the old uniform, the new one is a massive improvement. With the old uniform, I couldn't even complete the first phase in that 2-minute window. I actually hit the hard cap, and it took 3 minutes to even get to 38 health bars, meaning that I still had 8 additional health bars even after taking an additional 60 seconds compared to the new uniform. Once I added in some supports, I was able to comfortably clear stage 59 with well over a minute left. However, keep in mind that without that mighty CTP of Destruction, I'm pretty sure that she wouldn't have been able to clear this with no damage proc. With the same supports, I was also able to clear stage 64 of Mephisto, and did so with almost the same amount of time remaining. Though I will advise that if you do want to build this character for PvE specifically, that you go with a CTP of Rage. The character can work with a single skill damage proc, but she isn't really proc friendly. You have to cancel one of her skills and lose a lot of damage from it to be able to stick with the single skill damage proc like a Destruction or Energy. But if you use a CTP of Rage, you can get the benefit or the full benefit of the third skill while also being able to proc on everything, and you also get the benefit of her support, upping those numbers on top of that, which just makes her way better with the CTP of Rage for PvE. With the level 80 upgrade, the character becomes noticeably better, like many other characters as well, and you can see that she's able to complete stage 59 with over 2 minutes left, which means that this character would have been able to do this even if I didn't have the mighty CTP of Destruction on there. Even when I went to stage 84 of Null, she was able to complete it with over 2 minutes left, which again means that she probably could have done the same even without a damage proc. You can see a pretty similar clear time on stage 64 of Mephisto as well, with over 2 minutes left, though keep in mind that this is with the use of White Fox's support, since Captain Marvel has that leadership tag, so it does make a huge difference on those stages that you can use her as a support, because it provides a major buff to the character. You'll notice that once I took the character to stage 74 of Mephisto, that her clear time dropped by about 20 seconds, mostly because I couldn't use White Fox, but also because it is a higher stage. However, she was still able to complete the fight with well over 2 minutes left, and that's mostly because she has that increase to villain damage in her kit, as well as the buff to all buffs, so she increases the value of every single buff on top of that, which actually makes a pretty big difference, especially when you stack up multiple supports. If you don't use a CTP of Rage on Captain Marvel, you might find certain fights like the Ultron one a little bit more challenging, since you have to keep attacking him to keep the meter from filling up. That might be a little bit more irritating when you're using a single skill damage proc and you're trying to avoid procking early so you miss the proc on your main rotation, but I found that it's not really as bad. All you really have to do is just use the second and first skill after you finish your main rotation to keep that meter from filling, and then it should be pretty straightforward after that. You can see that even with the CTP of Destruction, I didn't really have any issues clearing Ultron, and did so again with well over 2 minutes left, almost 3 minutes left, so she could have done this even without a damage proc. The character's performance at level 80 is actually so good that I could almost complete stage 24 of Jean with over 2 minutes left, which is again the signifier that I maybe could have done it without a damage proc, but was just a few seconds shy of that, about 20 seconds or so. However, there is one thing that I wanted to mention, that in her kit, some people might think that the character might be a little bit flimsy when she's not T4, because it says that she only has 10% healing on her third skill, I believe. However, that's actually closer to 20% healing since you get 2 activations of it. And because of her passive that increases all buffs by 20%, it's actually closer to 25% healing. So even though that might seem like an issue and might be a problem once you get to higher stages to be able to survive, the mitigation that she has is so high versus villains, and the healing that she gets is adequate enough where that's not really an issue, and you don't really need to T4 her to get that extra healing on the T4 skill to keep her alive. That said, if you do T4 the character, she does become more durable because of the healing that you get from the T4 skill. The energy attack increase that she gets from the stat bump isn't too significant. Mine was only around 15,000. However, the T4 skill itself does give you up to 120% additional energy attack at the max level, which actually is closer to 145% additional energy attack with that passive considered. From the T4 stat bump, the HP increase is probably the most considerable, going up by about 25,000 for me. And if you have her artifact, it will also make a pretty big difference because of that passive increasing the damage even more from the artifact, and because the instinct numbers will also benefit from that as well. In terms of the striker to use for the character, Ghost Rider is likely the best option for both PvE and PvP because it matches her instinct type, so she can get the max level T4 skill, and because Ghost Rider has an iframe ignore for his striker skill, so you can benefit off of that in PvP and even in PvE if the boss goes into iframe. You'll notice from these world boss legend clears at T4 that the upgrade did make a noticeable difference. She's able to clear pretty much every one of the bosses about a minute faster, which might not seem too much compared to some other characters, but the ones that usually get a 2-minute upgrade when they're T4 don't really have necessarily the best performance at level 80, so I think that she is balanced pretty well, where her performance at level 80 is good, and the T4 does make a good impact and improve her performance even more. You'll also notice that in the Jean fight, or the Dark Phoenix fight, whatever you want to call it, I was able to complete the stage with over 2 minutes left this time, close to 3 minutes left, only about 20 seconds off, so that means that without a damage proc and having the character at T4, I would still be able to complete this stage. You can see from the previous clips that even with a suboptimal build like a Mighty CTP of Destruction, the character can perform pretty well in World Boss Legend. However, the character will likely excel the most in ABX and ABL, since there aren't really too many amazing options for the universal female days, and the character performs exceptionally well and is pretty much meta for those days when you have a Mighty CTP of Rage on the character. Even more so if you also have her artifact. From the testing that I've done and the ones that I've seen from other players, not only is she meta in ABX and ABL, but she is basically usable for all seasons even if you don't have her T4, since she has all of the cancel effects for all the different seasons between those two modes. I don't have her artifact, and her score with the Mighty Destruction was pretty okay. I was able to hit around 9.5 million, probably closer to 10 million if I played it a bit better, but a single skill damage proc just doesn't really work that well in the mode because all the enemies around the main boss just activate the proc early and kind of mess up your rotation. That's why a CTP of Rage just makes a massive difference compared to it. I would probably be able to score somewhere around 11 or maybe 12 million just with the Mighty Rage alone and not even accounting for the artifact. You can see that once I took the character to T4, I was able to hit around 11 million, which again with a CTP of Rage would probably be closer to 13 or 14 million with a somewhat decent build. Her performance in ABL with the Mighty Destruction and the T4 is almost not worth showing, since I could barely hit the procs in that mode with all the enemies surrounding him, and again you really need that CTP of Rage for the character to have any value in this mode. But I was able to hit around 4 million, with the artifact and a mighty CTP of Rage, I suspect that that's probably closer to 7 or 8 million pretty easily or without too much difficulty. You can take the scores that I'm predicting with a grain of salt, though I am basing it on what my other characters' performance changes have been from a destruction to a rage for the most part, and what some other people are scoring online. In terms of our skill rotation, if you're using a single skill damage proc, you do have to press the buttons pretty quickly, otherwise you might end up proccing early and just mess up your rotation. The one that I went with is to do a 1 and 2 cancel, and then do a 5 and 3 cancel pretty quickly into the 4th skill, which is the one that you want to proc on. Once you have access to your ultimate skill, the rotation is essentially the same, but to avoid messing up your proc, I would advise maybe not doing the 1st and 2nd skill, and just immediately going into the ultimate skill, canceling that, and then canceling the 5th skill, the 3rd skill, and again proccing on the 4th skill. Like many other characters, you want to use the T4 pretty much as soon as you get it. However, if your other skills are close to being off cooldown, then ideally you might want to time it with those. Keep in mind that if you're using a CTP of Rage, you don't want to quick cancel the 3rd skill, you want to delay cancel it, usually after the camera just changes a little bit, because that way you get the full hits from it. With a single skill damage proc, unfortunately, you don't really have that advantage. You have to quick cancel it, otherwise you're going to mess up your proc on the final skill. You can see that I was able to solo Dormammu within about 3 minutes with that Mighty Destruction, which actually isn't that great because, again, the character isn't really proc friendly, so I was ending up missing some rotations or procs on the rotations. That is why the CTP of Rage, again, is just so vastly superior if you're using the character specifically for PvE. Ironically enough, even though the character has a ton of PvP related skills, she has the coveted iframe ignore on her 4th skill, she has super guard break on her 2nd, 3rd, and 4th skill, has super armor, has damage reduction, even more damage reduction versus villains, as well as additional damage to them too. She has healing, a bit of invincible, and even a bunch of iframes or partial iframes across multiple skills. Even with all that, based on the testing that I did for the character in PvE and PvP, the irony is that the character seems to have more value in PvE and seems to be better situated for it. The main issues with her kit are kind of twofold. The first is that she doesn't have any kind of penetration in her kit, so if you're facing versus meta characters, especially ones with a defensive build who have even more invincible in their kit, she's just gonna sit there attacking them, trying to be able to penetrate the invincible and hit them. And as you know, with meta characters, you usually don't really survive that long versus them, since they'll go into their own super guard break skills or ones that can burst you down quickly. This leads into the second main issue with the character, which is that if you do want to get penetration, you have to get something like a CTP of Destruction equipped, and then the character becomes a little bit flimsy versus meta characters, because if you can't take them out quickly, then they'll still end up taking out the character. And the reason that is somewhat of an issue is because the 4th skill has kind of a delay on it of about a second to a second and a half. So she's just going to sit there kind of attacking the air while the opponent can potentially one-shot you in that period of time. Despite these faults, you can see that the character definitely isn't bad for PvP. Even at level 80 on auto, I was able to take out Gore and even T4 Genes. Once you can get the character to T4, her performance does become a little bit more consistent, but I found it largely doesn't make that much of a difference. The HP pool is the biggest increase when you get her to T4 in terms of these stats, but because the 3rd skill isn't really prioritized too much by the AI, it usually goes into the 4th and 5th skill for the most part, the healing difference because of the higher health pool doesn't make that much of an overall impact. I didn't really test out a defensive build for the character. I'm wondering whether something like a refinement or possibly a conquest could do well for the character to help with the healing, since her damage reduction is already really high, and I don't think stacking an authority on top of that would really help her out as much, since the main issue with her survival is just the healing and maintaining her health. However, I obviously opted against that and went with the Destruction to get the penetration and the damage proc, since I felt that was probably better versus meta characters, considering that they have a ton of buffs that they stack up as the fight continues and can lock down Captain Marvel with the super guard break. If you're going to be using Captain Marvel to fight meta characters, I would probably advise building her the same way with the Mighty Destruction, since you want that penetration and the damage proc to take out meta characters quickly. You don't really want to dance around with them, especially in a 3 vs 3 format where they can just wipe out your whole team as you're just trying to stay alive. And because she doesn't have penetration in her kit and the Mighty Destruction is likely the most optimal for her, you're also going to have the issue of potentially getting super guard broken, since you don't have the benefit of super guard break immunity that you usually get from some of the other PvP related CTPs. The character does seem good in a 1 vs 1 format, however she won't really be making any splashes in timeline, considering that characters that are used there need either something like immortality or revive to fill those top 3 spots. In this clip, I am playing the character on manual, and you can make pretty short work of Jean in this just because she has so many partial iframes that you can quickly go into to avoid her iframe ignore and some of her skills, and the 4th skill with the damage proc and the penetration can take her out pretty quickly. Other than that, versus some of the other characters, you're probably just going to die to their quick activation of skills, and it basically just comes down to luck whether you can take them out before they do the same to you. I don't really have any test footage for the character in a 3 vs 3 format, like Alliance Conquest. I did do some initial tests with her as a solo character versus villain teams, and she didn't really do anything. She just ended up dying almost instantly, and I think the main issue with that, again, is the 4th skill having a bit of a 1 to 2 second delay before any real damage is done, and I don't know if that's just because the hits aren't connecting or if the proc for the penetration just hasn't activated for those hits to actually go through. Unfortunately, versus meta characters, that 1 to 2 second window can make a massive difference, since they can essentially one-shot you in that period of time, which is exactly what's happening to her. Because of this, if people are getting the character and building her for PvP, like Alliance Conquest, I would advise that they don't take her to T4, since I don't think that the upgrade is really worth the value she provides there. If, however, you need a solid universal PvE character that is applicable for the female, universal, leadership, and energy projection restrictions in both World Boss Legend and ABX and ABL, then I think Captain Marvel is a very solid addition, specifically with a CTP of Rage. Just keep in mind that Loki is data mined to be the next tier 4, so if you do plan on getting him to tier 4, then you're likely going to need universal books for him in the next 2 weeks or so. Also, Scarlet Witch has done pretty well for the universal female slot in ABX and ABL, so if she does end up getting a tier 4 pretty soon, there is a pretty high chance that she'll tie Captain Marvel's score or potentially be the next meta character for that specific restriction. Either way, that kind of summarizes Captain Marvel's performance. I wouldn't necessarily rush to tier 4 her, but she is a very solid level 80 character, and depending on your roster, you can tier 4 her or just keep her there and should get pretty good value out of her. I'm not too sure what the next video will be after this. I'm thinking it might be a combined one for Spectrum and Nick Fury, and possibly Miss Marvel or Kamala Khan as well, though she didn't really change too much. I'm also looking a bit into what tier lists I want to upgrade or redo to prepare people for the Black Friday stuff. That kind of does it for this one though. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking, subscribing, and maybe sharing it with others. As always, I appreciate people taking the time to watch these, so thank you, but the video is now over.